Long before the headlines, before the sirens and the courtroom whispers, there was a man who seemed to have mastered life. Michael James Marin wasn't just successful, he was a spectacle of success. With his chiseled jawline, neatly tailored suits, and Yale law pedigree, he moved through the world like a man immune to gravity. And for a time, he was. Born on December 2nd, 1958, Marin grew up in the quiet town of Oak Harbor, Washington. He was raised in the traditions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, instilled early with discipline, faith, and ambition. Even as a boy, he wasn't content with small dreams. Teachers described him as driven, intense, even a little mysterious. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to conquer. By his early 20s, Michael had already graduated from Brigham Young University and set his sights on Yale Law School, a place known for producing presidents and power brokers. While most of his peers were still figuring out what to do with their lives, Marin was already making international deals in skyscrapers from Tokyo to Hong Kong. The financial world welcomed him with open arms. Wall Street giants, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Salomon Brothers fought to recruit him. He became known not just for his sharp mind, but for his appetite for risk. He specialized in complex investments, navigating foreign markets with the same confidence others reserved for ordering coffee. But money was just one frontier. Michael wasn't built to sit still. When he wasn't closing multi-million-dollar deals, he was training to climb mountains. Not metaphorical ones, real, snow-capped giants. In 2001, he stood atop Mount Everest, having scaled not just the world's highest peak, but also 5 others across 6 continents. He thrived in thin air, in danger, in moments that separated ordinary men from legends. Back home in Phoenix, Arizona, he built his sanctuary, a 6,600-square-foot Mediterranean-style mansion nestled in the prestigious Biltmore Estates. The house was a marvel, filled with rare artwork, antique furniture, and rooms customized to his every whim. Guests marveled at the grand piano in the foyer, the ornate woodwork, the high-end collectibles. Hanging on the walls were original Picasso etchings, one of which he'd purchased during a casual afternoon auction, like buying socks at a store. He was also a licensed pilot, a self-published author, and a father. But no one saw the fractures forming behind the grand facade. No one noticed the cracks in the marble or the man pacing late into the night. Even as he toasted guests in the garden or flew friends over the desert in his private aircraft, something inside him was shifting. Some of his neighbors began to whisper. Marin had always been eccentric, an adventurer, after all, but lately he seemed distracted, edgy, paranoid even. Strange shipments arrived at odd hours. Unusual equipment was seen in the garage. There were whispers about the mortgage, the economy, and whether Marin's empire had begun to wobble. But still, this was Michael Marin, the man who had climbed Everest, who'd walked through Wall Street like a colossus, who bought Picassos on a whim. He wouldn't fall, not him. And if he did, he'd find a way to make it look like a leap. Summer in Phoenix is merciless. The sun scorches everything it touches, and the heat rises from the pavement in waves. But on the afternoon of July 5th, 2009, the temperature wasn't the only thing rising in the upscale Biltmore Estates neighborhood. From the towering roofline of Michael Marin's Mediterranean-style mansion, smoke was curling into the sky. Inside the mansion, a fire had erupted. Fast, intense, and oddly contained in some areas. First responders arrived quickly, expecting the worst. Homes in this neighborhood weren't just valuable. They were sprawling, filled with intricate architecture and custom materials. A blaze in one of them could turn catastrophic in seconds. What they didn't expect was the sight of a man, barefoot, wearing scuba gear, descending a rope ladder from a second-story window. It was Michael Marin. Onlookers watched, stunned, as the man they knew as a Wall Street titan and world explorer made his theatrical escape from the flames. A black diving mask covered his face, and he clutched a small oxygen tank as if fleeing a sunken submarine rather than his own home. When questioned later, Marin said he'd been trapped upstairs by the smoke and flames. The diving gear, he explained, was simply good planning, an emergency precaution he happened to have on hand. "You never know," he said with a half-smile. But investigators weren't convinced. Something about the scene felt off. Fire officials noticed inconsistencies in the blaze. The fire had multiple points of origin. Accelerants had clearly been used, and yet Marin himself had no injuries, no burns, no smoke inhalation, not even a scratch. He hadn't stumbled out coughing or collapsed in a panic. He'd rappelled down like a man who had rehearsed it. The more they looked, the stranger it got. Inside the house, authorities found valuable items curiously missing: electronics, artwork, personal effects. Either Marin had incredible luck saving his most treasured possessions from the blaze, or they had been removed ahead of time. His insurance provider took note too. A policy was in place, generous and recently updated. As fire officials filed their report, a darker picture began to take shape. A man with a mountain of debt, a mansion he could no longer afford, and a lifestyle he couldn't maintain. The balloon payment on his mortgage, $2.3 million, was due the very next month. Privately, some began to ask, had the Everest climber found a mountain he couldn't summit? Still, no formal charges were filed, not yet. Michael returned to his life, or at least the version of it that remained. He moved out of the mansion, now a charred skeleton of its former glory, and tried to project normalcy. But something had changed. The neighborhood watched from behind closed blinds. No one asked too many questions, at least not out loud. But behind the scenes, the legal machine was beginning to turn. Michael Marin, the man who once stood on top of the world, was now under a microscope. And the view wasn't flattering. In the months following the fire, Michael Marin did what he always did. He adapted. He tried to maintain his signature composure, his air of control. He still wore tailored suits, still spoke with confidence. But something in his eyes had changed. The calm, calculating sparkle was dimmer. He looked over his shoulder more. What he couldn't outwit was the evidence stacking up against him. The investigation into the fire was slow but methodical. Arson cases always were. Detectives pored over the scene, examined burn patterns, and analyzed chemical traces. What they found painted a troubling picture. There were multiple ignition points, something no accidental fire would produce. Traces of accelerants, likely flammable liquids, had been found on the stairs and in various rooms. The fire had been set deliberately, with intent, and with planning. And Michael had a motive. He was drowning in debt. Public records revealed that he owed over $17,000 in back taxes. He was behind on his massive mortgage. His once fluid wealth had dried to a trickle. The grand image of the globe-trotting adventurer with Picassos on the wall and planes in the hangar was, at least in part, an illusion. In October 2010, over a year after the blaze, the facade cracked completely. Michael Marin was arrested and charged with arson of an occupied structure, a serious felony in Arizona that carried a sentence of up to 21 years in prison. The man who had conquered Everest, sealed billion-dollar deals, and once had his portrait featured in glossy magazines, now stood handcuffed before a judge. He posted bail, of course. He still had connections, still had some remaining assets, and, most importantly, he had his legal mind. Marin had graduated from Yale Law, after all. He knew how the system worked, and now he would use every ounce of that knowledge to save himself. For nearly 2 years, the case crawled through the courts. Michael, acting partly as his own legal strategist, challenged evidence, maneuvered filings, and delayed proceedings. He remained convinced, perhaps even believed, that he could win. But the prosecution had built a fortress of facts. The fire had been intentional. His escape had been theatrical. His financial situation was dire. And his home, his prized symbol of success, had become a smoldering stage for the final act of a desperate man. Behind the scenes, Michael continued to put on a brave face. He told friends it was a misunderstanding. That the fire had been tragic, yes, but accidental. He claimed he was being persecuted because of his wealth, his status. He smiled when cameras were on, but at night, alone, the silence grew heavier. For Michael Marin, the countdown had begun. A trial date was set, May 21st, 2012. And in the quiet before the storm, even he must have wondered how far a brilliant mind could bend fate, before it snapped. On the morning of May 21st, 2012, the doors of the Maricopa County Superior Court swung open, and Michael Marin walked in wearing a tailored Navy suit and a practiced, polite smile. He carried himself with the same quiet arrogance that had once closed deals in glass towers. To the jury, he wanted to be more than a defendant. He wanted to be understood. This wasn't just a trial. It was theater. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Local reporters filled the benches. Legal observers whispered in the aisles. Marin's case had everything: a millionaire adventurer, a mysterious mansion fire, and now, the looming possibility of prison. The fall from grace was too dramatic to ignore, but Marin wasn't panicked. Not yet. He sat confidently at the defense table, flanked by attorneys he had chosen carefully. He'd been deeply involved in preparing for trial. His fingerprints were on every motion, every argument. This was his chessboard, and he was ready to play. The prosecution began methodically. They brought in fire investigators, experts in combustion, accelerants, and structural damage. They explained how the fire in Marin's mansion had multiple points of origin, each acting like the first spark in a line of dominoes. They showed diagrams of the home's layout, heat maps, and photos of the aftermath: blackened beams, scorched walls, and the unmistakable signs of deliberate ignition. They painted a portrait of a man on the brink of financial collapse, desperate to escape the weight of his own ambition. And then they showed the escape. Jurors were shown footage of the bizarre scene that had stunned first responders. Michael Marin, wearing scuba gear, lowering himself down a rope ladder from the second floor of his burning home. Not coughing, not stumbling, but calm, collected, prepared. What kind of man prepares for a fire like that? The defense countered with character witnesses, technical challenges, and their own experts. They tried to poke holes in the timeline, to question the origin of the accelerants, to suggest alternate explanations. Marin had spent years building the appearance of control. Now he was fighting to maintain it one piece at a time. But something wasn't landing. Jurors watched Marin closely. He was articulate, charming even. But beneath it all, there was a chill, a kind of detachment. Prosecutors noted it too. The calculated phrasing, the subtle smiles, the way he seemed more like a man giving a lecture than fighting for his freedom. As the days passed, the weight of the evidence mounted: insurance documents, financial records, witnesses, technical reports. Every page read the same thing between the lines. Marin was out of money, out of options, and running out of time. He had orchestrated a fire not to escape the flames, but to escape his life. The jury listened. The courtroom grew heavier with each passing day. And though the defense continued to deflect, to question, to doubt, the truth had a shape that was becoming impossible to deny. Behind closed doors, Michael Marin knew the odds were turning, and for the first time in his life, he was no longer in control of the outcome. The verdict was coming. June 28, 2012. A heavy silence hung in the courtroom, like the desert heat outside pressing against the walls. It was the 10th day of deliberation and testimony. The jury had reached a decision. Michael Marin sat upright, his hands folded neatly on the defense table. He wore a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, and a maroon tie. Formal, almost ceremonial. His hair was combed, his posture poised. To the casual observer, he looked like a man attending a business meeting, not awaiting a verdict that could end his life as he knew it. In his jacket pocket, tucked away beneath the silk lining, was something no one else in the room knew about. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Everyone watched Michael. Even the judge glanced at him once, quickly, perhaps searching for a reaction that never came. A clerk stood. The foreperson handed over the slip of paper. The judge read silently for a moment, then looked up. Michael James Marin, on the charge of arson of an occupied structure. How does the jury find? Guilty. The word hit the room like a gunshot. Gasps, a shuffle of movement in the gallery. One reporter clutched her notepad tighter. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." But Michael? He didn't flinch. He turned slightly toward the jury, blinked, and gave what looked like a polite, almost bemused nod. A courtroom camera, rolling silently from the corner of the ceiling, caught everything. The stillness of his face, the slight pursing of his lips, and then the odd movement of his right hand, reaching under the table. He brought something to his mouth, a small capsule. He swallowed. Then, calmly, he reached for a sports drink on the table and took a sip. No one paid it much attention until, seconds later, his body jolted. It started with a twitch, then a shudder. His shoulders stiffened. His lips turned pale. And then he collapsed sideways in his chair. Gasps turned to screams. His attorneys jumped up. Bailiffs rushed forward. The judge froze, mid-sentence, her face blank with disbelief. Paramedics were called as the courtroom emptied into chaos. Marin convulsed on the floor, his breathing rapid and shallow. Foam formed at the corners of his mouth. By the time he was wheeled out on a stretcher, his pulse was faint, eyes vacant. He was pronounced dead within an hour at the hospital. An autopsy later confirmed what the world had already guessed. Michael Marin had ingested cyanide, a fatal dose, smuggled into the courtroom. Swallowed seconds after his guilty verdict was read. The man who had once scaled Everest, closed deals on Wall Street, and escaped a burning mansion had just pulled off one final shocking exit, in front of a live courtroom and on camera. It was a twist no one saw coming, but the real question was, why? In the days following Michael Marin's death, the headlines lit up like wildfire. Millionaire dies by suicide after guilty verdict. Yale-educated financier collapses in courtroom. Was it all part of the plan? The footage from inside the courtroom spread rapidly. Millions watched in disbelief as a man, moments after hearing the word guilty, calmly put something in his mouth and sipped a drink, then collapsed. The image became a symbol of a question no one could stop asking. Had Michael Marin orchestrated his own death just as carefully as the fire that led to it? Authorities found a small pill container in his pocket, discreetly labeled, easily overlooked. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of cyanide, a rare and lethal poison. Investigators began to trace its source, trying to understand how someone had managed to smuggle it into a courtroom. Speculation ran wild. Did he obtain it online? Did someone help him? Had he planned this for weeks? Or was it a last-minute decision made when he knew the verdict was inevitable? What became clear was this: Michael Marin had never planned to go to prison. For a man who had once stood on the highest peak on earth, who flew his own planes, collected priceless art, and lived in opulence, confinement was inconceivable. His pride, his identity, his very sense of self couldn't withstand the idea of a prison cell. So he found a different escape route. Those who knew him former colleagues, neighbors, even family, were left with conflicting emotions. Some were horrified. Others were strangely not surprised. Michael had always been brilliant, methodical, and theatrical. This, in its tragic way, was consistent with who he had been all along. But his death left a deeper question lingering in the air, one that the legal system couldn't answer. Was Michael Marin a victim of his own ambition, or its architect? In his fall, he exposed the fragile scaffolding that often holds up the illusion of success. Behind the wealth, the adventure, and the charm was a man haunted by debt, cornered by failure, and unwilling to be ordinary. His story became a case study in law schools, a cautionary tale in financial ethics courses, and a haunting example of how brilliance can be both a gift and a curse. The mansion he once called home was rebuilt and sold. His art collection was scattered. The mountains he climbed remained, indifferent to his legacy. And the courtroom where he took his final breath went silent once again. Michael Marin left behind no final words, no letter, no explanation, just a puzzle, and a silence louder than any verdict.